Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited to share that I recently launched 365 Days with Katherine of Aragon. This immersive learning experience is much more than just an online course. Over 12 months in 2026, participants will come together and contribute to a supportive and inspiring online community of individuals who share in a unique learning experience, one that will ultimately deepen their understanding of the life and times of Katherine of Aragon. Together, we'll explore many aspects of Katherine's life, from her origins and upbringing in Spain to her legacy and afterlife. I will guide participants every step of the way, but I'll also be joined by a stellar list of 28 contributors, including the renowned historian and broadcaster, Dr. Elizabeth Norton, who'll deliver the keynote address. Head to my website onthetudortrail.com for further details, including a full list of sessions, presenters, and testimonials from current participants. I do hope you'll consider joining me on this unique learning experience. I'd also, of course, like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Kavita Mudan Finn to the podcast to chat about Elizabeth Woodville. Kavita is an independent scholar who has published widely on medieval and early modern literature, Shakespeare, popular medievalism, and fan reception studies. She works as a freelance editor and indexer, and is writing a biography of the 15th century English Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, when not managing a two-child, two-dog chaos train in the wilds of New England. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Kavita. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing very well this afternoon. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I've been looking forward to our conversation. So a good place to begin would be for you just to introduce yourself to our listeners and just tell us all a little bit about you and your background.
Well, I am an independent scholar. I work as a freelance editor and indexer. I used to teach. I taught for about 12 years, and my most recent teaching position was at MIT in 2019 and 2020. I still do some academic writing when I'm able to, though I am mostly trying to finish off those projects so that I can focus on what I really want to write, which is fiction. So we'll see what happens with that.
Wonderful. Oh, that sounds fantastic. And I know that you're currently working on a biography of Elizabeth Woodville. So when did you first become interested in her story, and what do you think makes her such a fascinating subject?
Well, as to when I first became interested in her story, I can tell you exactly when that happened. It was when I was around the age of 12 and I read Sharon K. Penman's novel, The Sun in Splendor, for the first time. She's not exactly nice to Elizabeth in that novel, but I found her character so deeply compelling and she just stuck with me. And as I learned more and more about her, I realized her life story is unreal. It is such a soap opera. I am not at all surprised that she ended up becoming a fixture in just melodrama and historical novels and all kinds of things like that. So honestly, she's just fascinating. And she's in the middle of this period that I have always found incredibly fascinating. So she's just kind of the nexus of all of these different things.
Yeah, I think that's why modern audiences are so drawn to her, because it is a bit like a modern soap opera, isn't it? All the things that happen, of course, in her life. So she's born in around 1437. So can you tell us a little bit about what the political situation in England is like at this time?
So at this point in time, around 1437, King Henry VI is the King of England. He is about 14 or 15 years old, and he has been king since he was a baby. So whether or not how much of a role he actually has in everyday governance is probably pretty small at this point. The real power in England he had two uncles when he started ruling, and now at this point he has only one, and this is his uncle Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester. Although Henry was nominally also the King of France at this point, the French had been steadily taking back all of the lands that his father, Henry V, had conquered earlier in the century. So we've got a very young king who's not really perceived as very powerful. We've got an uncle, the Lord Protector, who is powerful, but is also a very divisive figure. Lots of people did not get along with Humphrey of Gloucester. And we've got these seemingly endless wars in France that are draining the English economy. They're making everybody unhappy. But the fact is that the English also don't want to stop. They don't want to withdraw because that would mean the French had won, and nobody wants to admit that the French had won. So that's about what the political situation in England was at this point in time.
Sounds like turmoil to me. I think that's why people never like a young or child king, because it always leads to these kinds of factions, doesn't it? So let's talk a little bit about Elizabeth's parents. So Jacquetta and Richard, and some of our listeners have probably heard of them. Who were they, and why was their marriage viewed as quite scandalous for the time?
Well, Jacquetta was the daughter of Pierre de Saint-Pol. He was a Burgundian nobleman, and she was related to the royal house of Luxembourg. So she's actually from pretty aristocratic blood from Burgundy in France. In 1433, she married John, the Duke of Bedford, who was Henry VI's other uncle. He was in charge of affairs in France, while the Duke of Gloucester was in charge of affairs in England. Bedford had been previously married to the Duke of Burgundy's sister, and it was reported that when he married Jacquetta, the Duke of Burgundy was none too pleased by this. So, through no fault of her own, she found herself in the middle of a bit of a scandal during her first marriage. As for Richard Woodville, he was a knight whose father, also confusingly named Richard Woodville, fought under Henry V during his French campaigns. The younger Richard was making himself his own reputation for being a knight when he was given a position in the Duke of Bedford's household. This probably happened shortly after his marriage to Jacquetta, so we're talking kind of 1433, 1434. Bedford and Jacquetta had actually come to England briefly during that time so that Bedford could petition Parliament to give him more money for his wars in France. And they returned, I think, late in 1434. And within a year of their return to France, Bedford died. He left a number of generous bequests to his widow, really unusually generous bequests to Jacquetta that included extensive estates in England and France, and also a number of books from his very impressive library. And it's at this point that we end up with something of a little black box. We have two parliamentary records from February of 1436 that confirm Bedford's bequests to Jacquetta, and the second one includes the explicit provision that she's not supposed to remarry without royal consent. Then, a year later, in March of 1437, Jacquetta appears once more in the royal records, this time paying a hefty fine of £1,000 for, you guessed it, marrying without royal consent. Why was this such a big deal? Because there was a statute forbidding royal widows from remarrying without the king's explicit permission. This had been put in place about 10 years earlier in response to rumors that several different men were considering trying to marry the Dowager Queen Katherine, Henry VI's mother. Ironically, that very same year, the Dowager Queen Catherine died, and her own secret second marriage was revealed to none other than a man named Owen Tudor. Which is all to say that 1437 was the year of scandalous royal marriages in England, and it may well be that part of the reason that Jacquetta and Richard got away with just paying a fine rather than going to prison like poor Owen Tudor was that the two of them had better court connections, that Jacquetta had this reputation, and she actually continued to be called the Duchess of Bedford for the rest of her life. It didn't matter that she had remarried. She still referred to herself, and other people referred to her as the Duchess of Bedford until she died. As for why they revealed their marriage when they did, I at least suspect that it was because she was pregnant, because Elizabeth was almost certainly born later that year.
That's amazing. This is what I love about women in this period. They do take matters into their own hands and push those boundaries. Absolutely love that. So often when we pick up the story of Jacquetta, it's when her daughters, of course, caught the attention of Edward IV. But I wanted to know a little bit more about Elizabeth's early life and her education as well. Do we know very much about that?
Sadly, we really don't. She most likely grew up at a manor called Grafton, which is located about halfway between the modern London and Birmingham and about 10 miles south of the city of Northampton. One thing that I at least have been wondering about, and that at least so far in my research I haven't found an answer to, is how much time Elizabeth's parents actually spent in France while she was growing up. It's possible some of their children remained in England. They may even have been born in France. Elizabeth may have been born in France for all we know. And that could be why we haven't been able to track down any baptismal records for any of them, because that's been one of the problems in trying to determine the ages of all of these Woodville children, all of these children of Jacquetta and Richard Woodville. I don't think we actually have concrete dates for any of them. And that's because all of the records are gone.
Yeah, that's a bit frustrating, isn't it? Always when we've got that paucity of record.
Frustrating. Yeah, but you've already seen this with a number of the queens of Henry VIII, for instance. We don't necessarily have birth dates for a number of them. So Jacquetta's marriage to Bedford, this had actually made her briefly the second lady in the land, which puts her right behind the Dowager Queen Catherine. And we know that Jacquetta ended up with a number of her husband's books, which included this absolutely magnificent presentation copy of the complete works of Christine de Pizan that Christine had actually given herself to the Queen of France at the time. And I at least think this may have been the base text for Elizabeth's brother Antony's translations of Christine de Pizan in the 1470s. We've got other books with ownership marks from Elizabeth's family that include John Gower's Confessio Amountis, the 14th century Roman de Melusine, and a number of Arthurian romances in French. So based on that, I think we can glean that Elizabeth and her siblings had an education very similar to their mothers, which was probably quite extensive for the time period. Jacquetta's first language was almost certainly French, which means that her kids probably spoke it. And they certainly could read it based on the books that they have in their family library. And we can also see the results of this kind of education in the reputation of Elizabeth's brother Antony, because he became, I think you've already done an episode on him. He was very, very well known for being a man of learning and a man of chivalry.
And you also talked earlier about the fact that, of course, Jacquetta is quite well connected at court. So what can you tell us about Elizabeth's mother's relationship with Queen Margaret of Anjou?
On the one hand, we really don't know much from written records, but there is a lot that we can imply or that we can speculate about. So first, in 1444, when the marriage was first being set in place, when the betrothal was taking place and they were celebrating everything in France, Jacquetta was almost certainly amongst the nobles who traveled in that party to escort Margaret to England, because she held this high place in the Burgundian nobility and also because of her position as the Duke of Bedford's widow. She would have known a lot of the other nobles who were there. She would have been a very good liaison between the English court, the Burgundian court. It's very clear that they were using whatever alliances and whatever allies they had for these purposes. So the regent of France at this point was Richard, Duke of York. And obviously he becomes very important a little later on. But as far as we know at this time, everybody was getting along. Nobody had any issues with anybody else. We have a number of pieces of evidence from Margaret's household records that Jacquetta received several very impressive New Year's gifts from the Queen. We also know that Jacquetta's husband, Richard Woodville, was a prominent member of Henry VI's court, enough so that after Edward IV became king in 1461, people found it notable that Richard Woodville and his son Anthony, as well-known Lancastrians, pledged loyalty to Edward. So that really tells us, I think, a lot about their position in the court. They were very much in favor with Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. The last indication that we have specifically related to Jacquetta is from 1461. Queen Margaret and her army were camped outside the gates of London, and they were demanding entry to the city. And the Lord Mayor did not want to give them entry. He was terrified. He didn't know what was going to happen. So he sent several ambassadors. He sent 2 bishops and he sent 3 ladies. One of those ladies was Jacquetta. This detail does not appear in all of the chronicles, but enough of them mention her that I'm pretty sure it actually happened, that I think that she was one of the people sent out to treat with Margaret.
So Elizabeth's marriage to John Grey. So John Grey, how does that come about? And what do we know about this period in her life?
Again, we know very, very little about this period in her life. We know that the Grey family, they were from a place called Groby. They weren't quite neighbors, but they were fairly close by. The families were well acquainted, and they had probably been betrothed since they were children. We don't know any details about how that happened. We don't actually even know when they got married, but we suspect it was probably 1452, sometime around then. They had 2 children, both boys. Thomas was born in or around 1455, though again, we have no surviving birth or baptismal records for him. This is based entirely on references to his age in later documents. We have even fewer records of his younger brother, Richard, but the one that we have is that he was knighted in the year 1475, which suggests that he was on the younger side, probably born 1459 or 1460, very close to his father's death. They probably lived in Warwickshire. The Grey family had a manor house there called Astley, and that seems like the likeliest place where they were living while they were married. But that's really all that we know about their marriage.
So I have seen people before say that Elizabeth served Queen Margaret of Anjou. Is that correct? Do we have any records to confirm that?
No, that was almost certainly not the case. The reason that this theory came about, first of all, it first appears in Thomas More's 1513 History of King Richard III. It's hardly a contemporary source, but because it's Thomas More, people just kind of took him at his word. But there are 2 women who did serve Margaret, or who were kind of in the court around that period, with very similar names. And so we suspect that just wires got crossed. There was, for instance, a Lady Isabella Grey who served Margaret of Anjou. She's been confused with Elizabeth in the past, but nowadays the general consensus is that these were 2 different women. There's also a very confusing letter from Richard of York talking about a proposed marriage for an Elizabeth Woodville, who a number of historians were insisting was actually Elizabeth Woodville. But again, the consensus is that these were 2 different people.
Oh, that's so interesting. And of course, given the handwriting of the time and the phonetic spelling, easy to make such mistakes, I think. So talk to us a little bit about the death of Elizabeth's first husband and the impact that this has on Elizabeth.
Sir John Grey's name begins to appear on commissions of array in December of 1459, but his military career is actually a very short and sad one. He dies at the Second Battle of St. Albans on the 17th of February, 1461. Now, just for a bit of context, between December 1460 and March of 1461, there were 4 different major battles that were fought in different parts of England. First, we had the Battle of Wakefield in December of 1460. It was in Yorkshire. Richard of York, the leader of his faction, was killed. Second, at Mortimer's Cross near the Welsh border, we had Edward, the new Duke of York, win a decisive victory at the beginning of February. Third was St. Albans, where Sir John Grey died, but also where the Lancastrians managed to rally and nearly occupy the city of London. And finally, we had the Battle of Towton in Yorkshire on the 29th of March, 1461. This was the single bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, and it put Edward IV on the English throne, which meant that not only was Elizabeth a widow, her husband had been on the losing side. So she was in an even worse situation than she otherwise would have been. The upside was that her father and her brother had survived all of these battles, and they had been pardoned as a goodwill gesture to the king. Even her mother got her dower lands granted back to her for the rest of her life by new letters patent. Unfortunately, though, this good fortune did not extend to Elizabeth herself. She was fighting with her in-laws over her dower lands, and this dispute was actually ongoing when she and Edward met very famously in 1464.
And let's talk a little bit about that, because of course there are a lot of popular legends about how Elizabeth came to meet Edward IV. We've seen it on screen many times. What does the evidence actually tell us about the beginning of this, incredible relationship?
Frustratingly little again. And unfortunately, the sources that offer the most information are the least reliable ones. What we can be pretty sure about is that Edward and Elizabeth did not have any sort of significant relationship as late as April of 1464, because at that point she was still bargaining with one of his courtiers, William Lord Hastings, for help with this property dispute. And that's something she wouldn't have been doing if she already had the favor of the king. Most of the sources claim that the two of them met on the 1st of May, which is not impossible, but is also a very convenient day for this kind of story. May is the month of love. Thomas Mallory tells us so in Le Morte d'Arthur. And the most popular version of the story is that on the 1st of May, Edward encountered Elizabeth on a road in Northamptonshire. She had placed herself there on purpose to petition the king for help with that property dispute that we keep coming back to. Only the king was so taken with her beauty that he followed her back to her family's home, and at some point during his time there, he asked her to be his mistress, and she said no. Now, anyone thinking about Anne Boleyn, I can see what you see, and it's outside the scope of today. But this story, where Elizabeth declares that she prizes her virtue over being the king's mistress, actually comes from a poem that was written in the court of Milan in the mid-1460s by a man named Antonio Cormazzano. It's then repeated in a famous Latin memorandum from 1483 and then gets its most expansive treatment in Thomas More's Richard III. So we don't actually know what happened is the short version. We know that Edward came to Grafton at some point in May of 1464, that he left shortly thereafter, and that while all of this was going on, there were still ongoing diplomatic negotiations with both the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of Castilla regarding possible marriage alliances. So then in September of 1464, during a session of Parliament, Edward drops this bombshell that he had secretly married Elizabeth. So we don't know when it happened. We don't know under what circumstances, but the official announcement was in September 1464. And at that point, there was no turning back from it.
No, and I don't think everyone was very happy with his choice of bride. So, you've just said there that it was a secret wedding, so I'm assuming we don't have any further details about that wedding. But she is often, Kavita, referred to as the first commoner Queen of England. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts. Would you agree with this title for Elizabeth?
She wasn't a commoner. This is a hill that I will die on. She absolutely wasn't in any, not as we would think of it and not as people in England at the time would have thought of it. Her father was a well-known and well-respected knight. His father had been the sheriff of Northamptonshire, which is not an insignificant position. And I've talked about her mother already. She styled herself the Duchess of Bedford for her entire life. She had so much land. She had so much money. That £1,000 fine that she had to pay was barely a drop in the bucket of what she possessed. So both her parents were well-known figures in the court of Henry VI, and Edward IV went to a lot of effort to cultivate them as soon as he became king. So she was definitely an unusual choice, and she was a significant step down from the other candidates for Edward's wife, which included Bona of Savoy, the French king's cousin, who ended up married to the Duke of Milan, and Isabella of Castilla, who we all know, ended up married to Ferdinand of Aragon. So Elizabeth was an unusual choice, but she is definitely not what we or anyone else would have considered a commoner.
Oh, I love doing a little bit of myth busting. And it's funny how those kind of rags to riches stories persist, even though they're based in absolutely no evidence. And isn't that interesting about Isabel of Castile? That's a what if to think about, isn't it?
Oh my God. The brain. Oh my God.
Yeah, I can't even get my head around that, actually. I'll have to reflect on that a little more. Kavita, the other thing we do on Talking Tudors when I first have my guests on is what I like to call 10 to go. So these are just 10 questions just to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one is, because I love visiting places connected to people in history, is about a historic site. Do you have a favorite historic site that you'd like to visit?
On the one hand, it's incredibly basic, but I do love the Tower of London. I always have. I got to attend a conference there actually in 2016, which meant I got to be there at night, which was absolutely incredible. I just wandered around, I think, for about 2 hours, and I had the place to myself. It was so amazing. I don't know that anything is going to be able to top that unless, I don't know, I managed to get into the Vatican Library or something like that.
Yeah. That's one on my list as well. It's amazing how these places do transform at night, and you can really picture it, candle lit. It's quite amazing. So I totally agree with you. I love the Tower. We are, of course, all bibliophiles here on Talking Tudors. So what about a book that you've recently read, or perhaps one that you're currently reading?
Well, I'm one of those people who's usually in the middle of about four at a time. Depending on my mood, I'll jump between them. I've been reading loads of romance novels lately, so that's a nice pile of stuff. But in terms of kind of adjacent things, I actually only recently started reading Gareth Russell's biography of Catherine Howard, which is
Oh,
just phenomenal. I was so thrilled to find it. I'd actually been preparing for a lecture at my local library about the queens of Henry VIII. And so I was kind of reading up on what people had done recently. And that one just the detail, the research, I mean, there's so little about Catherine Howard, but he managed to find so much. It was
yeah.
incredible. So that book just absolutely blew me away. But that one is definitely on the top of my list. There's also a romance novel by an author named Elizabeth Grace. It is actually titled Elizabethan Mischief, and it is a
Ooh.
ton of fun. It is unsurprisingly set in the court of Elizabeth I, and it has two protagonists, and it is a lot of fun. I highly recommend it.
Oh, that sounds good. I love that. I'm exactly like you. I don't know how many books I read at the same time and listen to them as well. If only we could consume this while we're sleeping, I always think that would be helpful to get through the TBR list. And Gareth is an incredible historian, so witty, charming, lovely person. And the Catherine Howard biography is my favorite biography of Catherine. So I'm glad you mentioned that one. In terms of writing, when you're working and you're writing, do you have any sort of rituals that you like to follow?
Well, this is one that I have had since I was a graduate student, or actually maybe even since I was an undergraduate. I always have music. And some of the music is the same from I think like the late 90s, early 2000s. There's just a whole collection that I have that I still listen to for working, including, unsurprisingly, perhaps The Lord of the Rings.
Love it. Yeah, I love a bit of atmospheric music to get the creative juices flowing. So what about an ideal Sunday morning for you? What might that look like?
Ah, sleeping in and having having enough time to just sit and read and drink coffee. I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, so that usually doesn't happen.
Absolutely, that sounds perfect. And is there a new skill that you would like to learn?
Oh, goodness. There are several that I would like to learn. But I think one of them would have to be my sister got me a cross stitching kit, like this
Oh,
tiny little stocking stuffer cross stitching kit. And I've done about half of one of them, but I'm really bad at it. So I would like to get better at that. I keep having to pull out my stitches and just redo
yeah.
everything. It's an entire thing.
You're good. I've
But I
got
also
one
need
and I
the
haven't
time.
even started. So you're doing better than me on that front. But it is a very kind of medieval skill, isn't it? So I'd like to have that as well.
And it's one of those where if you can get into the rhythm of it, it's actually really soothing. But
Yeah,
I have to be able to kind of get into the mood, and I need the
absolutely.
time as well.
And what about when you were a child? What did you hope to become when you were older? Have you always been a writer and enjoying history?
Yes, I actually wanted to be a writer from
Hmm.
when I was very, very young. And it was something that I kept doing, and I kept kind of having trouble because it turns out not everyone wants to read extremely esoteric historical fiction coming from a 12-year-old, strangely enough. So for a very long time, that's actually how I ended up in academia, was because I had intended to go into creative writing, but was discouraged vehemently from doing so. And so I ended up taking the academic track instead.
Oh, well, I look forward to hearing about your debut historical fiction novel very soon, Kavita.
Hoping so.
In terms of a travel destination, somewhere that you might like to visit, perhaps somewhere you haven't been, but that might be on your bucket list?
Istanbul has to be high up there. I have wanted to go there for such a long time, and I have never managed to make it. Istanbul and Cyprus.
Lovely. Yes, Istanbul's on my list as well, actually. I think that would be quite amazing. And what about a favorite season? Do you have one, and why?
I live in New England, so it has to be
Oh,
autumn. We have the most beautiful autumn. It's crisp and it's cool, and I live in the middle of the woods, so there are leaves, and it's wonderful.
oh, that is a beautiful, beautiful corner of the world, I have to say. And autumn is my favorite, so I love that. What about in terms of authors? This doesn't have to be a historical fiction author or anything to do with history. Do you have a favorite author that you kind of keep going back to or that you like to read lots of their work?
I have a number of them. I tend to sort of find an author, and if I like them, I will read as much as I can get
Yeah.
my hands on. Having to choose a favorite one is hard, though.
It's one of your
Yeah, let's
favorites then.
see. Guy Gavriel Kay is one of my favorites. I have been reading his work for like 20 years now, and I have yet to read a bad book from him. I have read some that are better than others. I have read some that absolutely destroyed me emotionally.
Yeah.
His stuff is a little difficult to explain because it's not quite fantasy, but it's not quite historical fiction either. It's almost alternate history, but there's just a tiny bit of fantasy kind of tucked in there. He's a Canadian author and he's absolutely wonderful. So I highly recommend his books to anyone who wants kind of historical fiction with a twist.
Love it.
My favorite of his is probably The Lions of Al-Rassan, which is loosely based on kind of 8th to 9th century Iberia. Another author who I've only recently gotten into, or at least recently in the past 5 to 6 years, is Tracy Dion. She's a YA author, young adult author, who has written what might be my favorite contemporary Arthurian retelling of all time. The first book is called Legendborn. It is phenomenal. The third book has just come out. I haven't read it yet because I know that the second it is in my house, I will get nothing done until I finish it. So I'm not allowed to read it until I finish the work I'm supposed to be doing.
Oh, I love that. And I think I'll have to add a couple of those to my TBR list, which is huge and never ending. And final question for you, Kavita, is about what you'd like to do to relax and unwind. Obviously, a lot of brain power needed for all these wonderful projects you're doing. So what's your favorite kind of relaxation thing to do?
Well, I mean, reading is definitely one of them. A couple of days ago, actually, on a recommendation from a friend of mine, I sat down with the first, A Court of Thorns and Roses?
Oh, yes.
That people keep talking about. And I will be honest, I don't know if it was good, but I read it in 6 hours. It absolutely flew by. So I'm still deciding how I feel about it, but I definitely enjoyed it. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing that I enjoy doing, where I live, one of the things that we have is lots of trails, lots of woods, lots of mountains, lots of trails. So we spend a lot of time out in the woods during the warmer seasons. We have a basset hound who loves to go running, chasing things. So we spend a lot of time kind of walking in the woods. It's so nice.
Yeah. Nothing like being out in nature. I think it's so, meditative and wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
So love that. And I did say that was the last question, but there is one more thing, and then I will absolutely let you get on with your evening. And that is the Tudor takeaway. So I do ask all my guests for a takeaway. Of course, this doesn't have to be a Tudor one. It could be a more medieval takeaway if you like, but something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
Well, one thing that I would urge everyone to do is when you come across something that you've heard, like a commonplace about the medieval period, I urge you to stop and think about where you found it, because where you get your information matters. And there is so much nonsense out there about medieval Europe and really the medieval world at large. So I urge everyone to check their sources when they are coming across things. And this is I have found this to be the case even with Elizabeth Woodville, the number of things that people have assumed about her. And the moment you actually look into where they got things from, you realize they didn't get them from anywhere. They were just making it up.
Yeah.
Someone even made up an entire portrait. It's quite amazing.
And now with AI, it's all even more confusing, isn't it? Because we've got so many of those portraits out there. And of course, if this isn't your thing, you don't do this often, you could be confused and think that they're actual portraits of the people, which is not good.
No, it's not. It confuses things way too much. So yes, if I had to give anyone a takeaway, it would be keep an eye on your sources. Make sure if you come across something and it seems off, it might be.
Exactly. Oh, I love that. That's really good advice. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the podcast. It's been so fascinating to chat with you and to talk about this incredible woman, Elizabeth Woodville, and her family. And I'm so looking forward to your biography. So is there anywhere where people can kind of go to keep up with your work, website, etc.?
Well, I have a website, and the one part of it that I am very good at keeping updated is my publication section. So
Wonderful.
it is kvmfinn.wordpress.com. There is a blog on there, and if any of your listeners are into House of the Dragon, they might find some interest
I am.
there. Oh, well, yeah, I recapped both seasons. They're all there.
Fabulous.
So that's on there as well. I can be found on Blue Sky under KVM Finn, and yeah, that's about it.
Wonderful. I will add links to those to our show notes to make it nice and easy for everyone to find you. And I'm going to go and have a look at those articles because that sounds right up my alley. And once again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been delightful.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On the Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.